Rural France, with its delicious seasons, for centuries the home of the world's finest wines and most famous wine growers. Joining the French in this very Gallic art and craft is a special English woman, Patricia Atkinson.
I moved here with my husband nearly 20 years ago. At the time, I didn't speak French, and I certainly didn't know anything about wine. The house did have 4 hectares of vines, but we were never planning to work those vines ourselves. And I think in those days, James, what he really wanted was to have a bottle of wine with his name on it. It wasn't that we wanted to make wine ourselves. James becomes rather ill. He does decide to move back to England to try and find a job because we're now penniless, and also to try and get better, and asks me to stay here and work the vines. Well, given that I'd never driven a tractor in my life and couldn't speak French and didn't know anything about vineyards or wine, I think you can say it was a very steep learning curve. Obviously it was fairly difficult in the early days. What are now simple things seemed insurmountable. But I think that once you start to want to do something, you're driven by a desire to do it as best as you can. Well, the wine growing season, you can split it into 2 parts, viticulture and viniculture. The viticulture is what happens in the vines. In spring, we cut away any odd pieces of wood that are left and leave 1 lat for this year's growth. The next thing you do is you tie those lats onto the bottom wire. There are 3 stationary wires on a vine and 2 that you lift up or down depending upon what's happening during the season. Those lats are tied onto the bottom wire. They have a number of buds on them. Each of those buds grows into a stem with bunches of embryo grapes on them. At that point, you start the period of growth activity in the vines. You have to lift those 2 wires up to bring the great long branches that have since grown like magic in a few weeks up and bring them into shape. The grapes grow quite quickly. They start as very small green embryo bunches, small dots, but very quickly they grow into hard green bullets, if you like. And then over a period of 3 or 4 weeks they slowly change colour and start to look like the sorts of things that you and I might want to eat. I am part of the community here, but I think one of the reasons that I am and became part of it so early is that in a way I reached out to my neighbours. I think the day they saw me sitting on a tractor working was the day they decided that I was somebody they'd quite like to know. Country people respect people who work, and I think they recognised as sort of a communality of spirit. And once I started to be able to communicate with them, to speak French, in a way I was like them, and I think that counts for a lot. It's just a life full of a community. Neighbours will pass by and just come and say hi, tell me about their vines as opposed to my vines, ask me if I've had any problem with mildew, because they have. Juliana, who lives in the house at the bottom of the road, comes up 2 or 3 times a day, either to bring mushrooms or to just tell me the latest thing that's happened in the village.
Bonjour Patricia.
Bonjour Juliana.
Ça va?
Ça va très bien, et toi?
Ça va.
Comment va Yves?
Ça va, ça va. Écoute, je viens de recevoir.
I think back to my life in England. Not that life in England wasn't good, but it was so different. I lived near Windsor. People didn't call in and out every day. We live a much more insular life, I think, in England. And here, even though I'm in the middle of the country, there isn't a second to spare, and it's a very full life with a lot of interaction with the village and people.
People often drop in for a wine tasting.
We'll start with the classic white. So it's 50% Sauvignon, 30% Semillon, 20% Muscadel. And if you were going to be doing a professional tasting, we pick it up by the stem and don't agitate it. So if you like to pick it up...
Not agitate.
No, right. And just put your nose in. Everybody smells something different when they put their nose in. If you then swizzle it, but clockwise, and put your nose back in, and it releases the bouquet. Generally speaking, if it smells nice in the glass, it's going to taste nice. It's very rare that it smells nice and tastes awful. And if it tastes nice, then it's a really nice glass of wine for you. And after all, you're the one that's buying it. Bergerac wines don't have the reputation of Bordeaux wine. If a wine has Bordeaux on the label, people are going to say, oh yes, Bordeaux. Whereas if it's got Bergerac on it, they're expecting a cheaper wine and something that's not quite the same type of thing, which is a complete fallacy because people in Bergerac these days are making fabulous wines.
To qualify for the Bergerac appellation, a wine goes through a rigorous selection process, with renowned local wine growers sampling each and every new wine brought forward.
The tasting is a very important part of life of the wine growers. Every year there is an agreement. They need to have this agreement to sell the wine with the AOC and the Bergerac appellation. Very important for the wine growers to improve the wines. The CIVRB, it's the Wine Institute of Bergerac Wines, who makes the promotion for the all vineyards and the all wine growers and producers. The analog is the man or the woman who makes some studies in the wine specificities and who can explain the real taste of a wine. There is a few wine growers who are clients of this laboratory, and there is some analog who make some advice to the wine growers, and they help the wine growers to make the better blend, to make the better wine.
The white wine is made from 3 grape varieties, Sauvignon, Semillon, Muscadel. The Sauvignon ripens first. In theory, the Semillon ripens second, but sometimes the Muscadel can ripen before the Semillon. So you're always making value judgments about when you're going to pick, how you're going to pick, just waiting for the grapes to become delicious, ripe and luscious. So you are very much reliant on the forces of nature, because actually you can do everything right in the vines, and one day a thunderstorm or a hailstone will come along and remove your crop. But that's another thing that, in a way, although it's stressful, it's very exciting, because there's nothing you can do. Man can't change that. And when you look at fabulous jewel-like bunches of ripe red grapes, you just think that this is a bit of a miracle. Merlot grapes are always picked before the Cabernet Sauvignon. The Cabernet Sauvignon is usually the last to ripen, and it gives me huge stress, and I'm not alone. All the winemakers in the area have the same problem, because given that you've got wonderfully ripe Merlot and that you're going to mix it with Cabernet Sauvignon, you actually want wonderfully ripe Cabernet Sauvignon. But it takes a long time, and quite often, before it's properly ripe, the rains come and wash away some of the concentration. You then have to wait for it to reconcentrate, which doesn't always happen. So that provides a huge stress factor. And at the end, when most winemakers have finished their white and their reds and are breathing a sigh of relief because at least the grapes are safely in the chai, where it's more under your control, we here at Clos de Vigne are just about to start picking La Pourriture Noble, which is noble rot. It's botrytis, which is a particular type of fungus that falls on some grapes but not all. You can see the one we saw earlier had lovely pink stains on it, and those pink stains here have developed into noble rot. So they're becoming shriveled and what we call confit. So it's a confit grape that has a fungus that concentrates the sugar but gives a perfect acid balance. And it looks awful, but let me tell you, it tastes utterly delicious.
The worry and stress of the growing and harvesting over, for most experts, the most skillful part of the winemaking art comes now. In the chai, where the vats and barrels are gently tended and cared for.
You pick your grapes, you then breathe a sigh of relief because you've got them safely in your chai, and that's when the other work starts, which is viticulture. I'm going to simplify it. You bring your grapes in, put them into a vat, grapes, skins, pips, pulp, and macerate for a couple of days. If it's red wine, you then inject with a cultured yeast, made to ferment at high temperatures, because red wine you want to ferment hot. White wine you want to ferment cold. So the yeast that you put into the white wine is a specifically made yeast to cope with low temperatures and not stop fermenting. So once the wine arrives in the barrels, it's vaguely under control, and there is work to be done. Every 6 weeks you take it out of barrels to aerate it and put it back in barrels. There are periods of work intensity when you can make as many mistakes in the chai as you do in the vineyard. It's a different stress to the whole of the year outside when you're worried about what nature's going to do to you. You learn as you go along, and each year is different. And each time you make a mistake, you have to just find a way and a means to rectify it. I think also you should never say, well, this is great, I've made a wonderful wine, I now know how to do it. Because quite frankly, you don't. You're sort of under control, you're just making sure everything continues to do what it's supposed to do, all on its own, as nature intended it, in the chai, but you're protecting it and looking after it. But you have periods of calm.
C'est le ronfle. C'est normal.
Oui, oui. Le boulage, oui. C'est le... Maman, c'est ça.
Ça, il faut trouver.
Merci. Très bon.
Il est très bon.
Oui,
c'est une petite baguette. Oui, c'était l'anglais.
Gageac-et-Rouillac.
Exactement. Et aussi celle qui a de petits...
Ah oui, oui.
Je sais pas le nom. Une boulangerie Near Intermarché.
Oui.
And if somebody had told me 20 years ago that I'd be living in France, speaking French, making wines, I'd have said they were quite mad. My life is here, and I am really more French than English in a way. In summer there are lots of English, but my life is a French life here. I write for the local newspaper, one article a week, which is very nice. It's both in French and English. So I've got, if you like, a notoriety here because I'm one of them, and I think they're quite proud of me. I hope so. I'm pretty proud of them.